Dr. Julie, welcome to the show. I'm so pumped to have you on.
Thanks for having me. So happy to be here.
Yeah, it's been a few years since I've been following your work. I can't believe that much time has flown by before we connected, but something has stood out to me in the way that you kind of share content. You really focus around sleep, and it's kind of this theme that I felt as I've gotten a little older over the past few years. Like, oh, I can't really, I can only stretch my limits so much, and it's kind of something that I need to prioritize. And I always think about, like whenever I hear somebody is involved in neuroscience in any way, I guess I just have like this, image of you being in a laboratory doing really cool things, studying cool stuff. And so I'd love to know what your day to day kind of looks like, and some areas that you're kind of excited about, because I'm sure each neuroscientist has their thing. So I'd love to know a little bit about what yours is.
Absolutely. Well, the field of brain is massive, and there are so many different niches within that. And so, to give people context that aren't as familiar, I am a cognitive neuroscientist, which means I really specialize in human brain activity with behavior. So, really understanding the neural mechanisms of that and um, less about, microscopes and cells and mice in a maze. So I haven't actually ever worked with animal models. I work only with humans, and I've never worn a lab coat. So just gonna
That's
dispel
awesome.
that stereotype, I guess. But yeah, a lot of what I do day to day, when I was more so I work at a translational research center, so I get to be very focused on translating our scientific discoveries into training content, products, speaking engagements, programs, different things that are going to engage your everyday person and make that accessible to them and really actionable, kind of like you were saying, giving people guidance of what to do. Because scientific discoveries are great, but if they stay in journals that nobody reads, then it doesn't benefit anyone. And we know that it typically takes several generations currently for scientific information to trickle down into the spheres of public health, and that is just way too long. And so I really feel passionate about helping to close that gap and shorten that time from discovery to someone being able to use it and benefit from it in their life.
Yeah, I feel like that's the, more exciting part, at least as a user, right? Getting to hear the actionables of what you're kind of actually studying and what others are studying. One of the things I was thinking about, what I mean, we talked a little bit about this off air, was focus.
Mhm.
It seems that in 2024 and beyond, there's going to be a lot that's geared towards selling, like packaging focus up in a bottle and selling it, right? Not exactly just a supplement, but even like Kindles are really big now, right? Where you're not reading on your
Mm,
iPad, you're just reading on the Kindle. There's writers. The typewriters are coming back, right, to allow writers to focus a little bit more and not have distractions. There are pins that can turn your phone into a dumb phone, right, instead of a smartphone. So
yeah.
I think that was a theme to me that excites, like taking the things that you know and that you study. How do we translate that to enhancing focus, I guess, in this episode? Because that I feel is applicable to anybody. Like, if anything you want to do, no matter what it is, there's going to be some level of focus required. And there seems to be a lot coming at us more than at least there was 10, 15 years ago, at least in my opinion. So I'm curious how you see some of the things that you talk about translating over to that focus, because you do talk a lot about sleep and hydration. And maybe that's just a healthy byproduct, right, of doing those things as you have more
Mm.
focus.
Yeah. We are in an age of information overload, and we have, incredible access to things at our fingertips. But that also means just we have to sift through a lot more. And so I think, in this day and age of being constantly connected and plugged in, we are building distracted brains. And so we know that our brain is designed to adapt and change to whatever environment it's in. It's the gift of neuroplasticity. And So, when we are constantly being interrupted and pinged and have push notifications and emails and, all these other things continually happening that interrupt our focus, we get used to that. And our brain is then trained to expect interruption. And then when we're actually able to sit and focus without interruption, then we just have internal interruptions, right? Where we're like, oh, I need to go do this, or I didn't, my phone didn't even go off, but I'm going to check it anyway. And so, I want people to understand that, the brain you have is a brain that you have built, but you can change it and you can choose to do differently. You can change your lifestyle, you can change your environment to change how you want that to happen, but it's not going to happen overnight. And it is going to take some effort because those habits and the neural connections that you have formed and strengthened over, every single day, multiple times a day, day in and day out for maybe years, it's going to take that same level of consistency and effort to create new neural pathways and to change that. But the good news is that you really can, and it doesn't have to take years necessarily. We can see benefits even, in weeks and months, depending on what that habit might be.
Because I heard this a few years back where, and I don't know how true it is, right? But it's like being 2% dehydrated off of like your baseline, right, is enough to kind of throw off your mood, throw off your energy, like feel groggy. And I thought that was so crazy because it's like I was expecting a larger number than 2%. But I'm curious how, like, tell me a little more about the role of hydration and how that affects your brain and its performance because I feel like food is talked about a lot and
Mm-hmm.
all the time, right? There's pages and pages dedicated to it, but water seems to be boring amongst like everyone. Nobody harps on that.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious because like sometimes I even notice when I drink coffee in the morning, like if I haven't hydrated well before I drank the coffee, it doesn't hit as hard as it normally does, when
Mm.
I'm hydrated. And that could be a mental thing, but there does feel like, oh, we're made up of a lot of water. Like, what happens when you do lose a couple percentage points of that? How much of an impact does that have on everything else?
Yeah. Okay, I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but I think the brain is 70% water. Um, so even a slight variation in that is definitely going to impact brain performance, cognitive performance. We know that dehydration impairs concentration. We've seen in research that it increases your reaction time. We've seen dehydration create short-term memory problems. And then, as you mentioned, things like moodiness or anxiety. Um, and the thing with hydration is that drinking water helps to maintain healthy blood circulation and blood flow. A lot of people think of that maybe like for heart health or kind of like physical activity, but it's just as important for your brain because blood flow brings glucose and oxygen to your neurons, which is the essential fuel that they need to fire and communicate with each other. So if you are dehydrating, you're, putting your brain at a disadvantage. And I think it's something that, like you said, is really easily overlooked. Water's not exciting. Everyone knows you're supposed to drink water. It doesn't mean that we drink water, but and especially if you're doing something like drinking coffee regularly, which actively dehydrates you, or if you had a couple drinks the night before, again, alcohol dehydrating your body and you're not rehydrating to replenish to get back to your baseline, that's definitely going to affect your cognitive performance. So I think it's like if you want a little boost in the afternoon rather than reaching for a cup of coffee or an energy drink, drinking a glass of water can actually do quite a lot for your attention and focus.
I'm sure you know people like this too, because I can think of a few off the top of my head, some family members, some friends who they don't drink any water. Like I've never seen them when I'm around them ever have a water bottle. It's like they like Diet Coke or they drink iced tea. And it's like, I know people also who have had like kidney stones and stuff because that's all
Hmm.
they drink, right? But how is it that folks who regularly, let's say, do that, Diet Coke is their drink of choice over water, for example, like, do you become adapted to just, kind of using that and getting by on it to where you're not really feeling kind of the, bad effects of it as much? Or do you think like they just mask it a little better and they are feeling a little groggier and whatnot. Because I feel like some people are so far off of like a norm. I don't know what the normal water baseline
Yeah.
is, but even if it's like 64 ounces, like a lot of people I know don't even get in a full water bottle in a day or something, you know? So, how do you explain, I guess, that phenomenon?
Yeah, you touch on something really important. I mean, I agree. I don't know what the exact stats are, but just from anecdotally, the people in my life, I think it is a challenge for people to just get their 8 glasses of water a day, right? Which is like bare minimum. I don't know that a lot of people are doing the bare minimum. And I think, to the friend or family member that you can think of that just never drinks water, because I have people like that in my life too. And I don't think that the body necessarily or the brain really adapts to that, but I think that that becomes their baseline and they're sort of just used to feeling, maybe a little more moody, maybe a little more fatigued, brain fog, not as good of concentration. Like, I think so many people are so used to just kind of feeling not that great that that just becomes normal. And so they don't really notice, like, they don't know a difference. They don't know that they could feel better. Um, I heard this example recently with social media that when something is ever present, you don't have really a good comparison to know how you would do without, in this case, without it, whereas in the other case, it's with the hydration. But, um, and so they were like, to really assess how social media is affecting your mental health, it's like, try to do 2 weeks without it, like do a full detox and then notice how you are, to have a fair comparison. So I think many people truly just don't feel optimal, but that's quote normal for them. And so they're satisfied with that.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like that's probably accurate. One of the things I'm curious about, because I used to do this when I was in like middle school, me and my friend, he was like a track athlete, I was like a wrestler. And you know how there's like 8 periods or 10 periods, something like that, or maybe six, but whatever. I think there was eight, right? And each one is a class. And so every period we would try to drink a full bottle of water and then go refill it like in the fountain. And we maintained that for a long time, right? And one of the things I noticed that like didn't really improve was like I still had to go pee like every like you know what I mean? Like just as often. It was not like, oh, I've adapted after 3 months of drinking over a gallon a day. It's just like, nope, you just actually do have to like go that often. Is that normal or is that some, you know what I mean? Because when people
Yeah.
start drinking more water than they do, I'm sure that's something you have to think about. Like I had a client who was a lawyer and he drove 2 hours each way to his,
Oh, wow.
4 hour commute every day. So if you think about that, like you're not drinking water on the way, you're not drinking water on the way back, you're probably limiting it a little bit before you leave. Cause like if you don't have a rest stop or something, like, all right, I'm
Hmm.
not doing that. So how much of an impact does it have on
Yeah.
urination, and is that normal?
Um, it's funny. A while back, I did a hydration challenge, and someone at the office, I still to this day don't know who it is. So if you're listening, tell me, come forward. But they made these funny signs on the bathroom, and they were like, "Are you participating in the hydration challenge too?" And like just like, um, but anyway, yeah, I mean, I think that's normal. I think that, fluid comes in, it's got to come out. And I think it's a really healthy sign that your system is working and able to use that. And it's the body's way of flushing out toxins as well. So it's helping so many more systems than just the brain.
I want to kind of switch over a little bit now to sleep, right? Because this is another big chunk, just like hydration. And I'm sure you help people with this, just like you do with hydration too. What are some of the points of friction that you notice? Because when we kind of give, like, when we talk about sleep as, like, yeah, of course we should get 8 hours a day and, do all those things. But, like, realistically, it rolls around to that time of night and, you might be rewatching Ozark or something. And you're like, oh, wow, I actually like getting enough sleep means I need to trade this off, right? What are some of those things that you notice with people? And is there friction in them doing so?
I think everything in our current culture creates friction for sleep. I think
Yeah.
every single thing about our society and the way that at least American culture is currently set up is like against sleep. If I had to narrow it down to just probably two big ones, it would be social activities and technology. um, social and like I'm out to dinner late with friends, or I'm gonna go to this party, or, I'm traveling and then I'm jet lagged, or I've got late flights, or traveling for work, or, just things that you're out doing stuff. I went to a concert, whatever. Um, the people don't want to sacrifice those things for a consistent bedtime. And then the second one being technology of just we're on our phones, we're on social media, we're binging shows, playing video games or talking on the phone, using that time to either kind of numb out or catch up, or it's like that's your kind of way to unwind a little bit and from the day, procrastinate doing other things that you need to do. And so I think those are huge. I thought this was interesting. There was a Gallup poll that came out. And so it said today, only one in every four people reported getting 8 or more hours of sleep. So that's one out of four is getting like the adequate amount of
Right.
sleep. That's a quarter of our population, or a quarter of the people that answered the survey. And then they said 1 out of 5 people, 20%, are getting 5 hours or less. So that's like a fifth of the population is sleep deprived, like pretty
Wow.
chronically, which is massive. Like 1 out of 5. I mean, and there's the reports of like driving when you're tired is like equivalent to driving drunk, or that we have these physicians that are working the night shift or pulling all-nighters, and it's like so dangerous. But what was interesting is this comparison to the 1940s. So at that time, 60% of people reported sleeping 8 or more hours. So that's
Wow.
like 6 out of 10 people were getting enough sleep, and only 33%, so only like a third of them, reported getting 6 to 7 hours, and no one reported getting 5 hours or less. So there's definitely something that's been happening more recently. And I would say probably the things that have changed the most has just been technology and the accessibility of that. And it's in everyone's pocket, and everyone, has a device. Um, just so much more widely. Whereas before it was like, there was one TV in the home, it was in the family room. There was like, one evening show that everyone watched, and that was it. And so now it's just like things are on 24/7. And it's an attention economy. So these programs, social media, the algorithms, they're all designed to capture and hold your attention. And so it's really hard. We have to actively work against that to be able to, set parameters of like you said, it's like, oh, I'm in the middle of watching the show. Like, okay, that means I have to like end on a cliffhanger, or I've got to just turn it off, or, it just kind of auto plays to the next YouTube video or whatever it is that you're doing. So really having to be aware of those things and then put some parameters in place to help protect your sleep. And I think for a really long time now, people just have not understood the vital importance of sleep for brain function and really every aspect of health.
Do you think that it gets associated with wealth? Like, oh, when I'm really rich and wealthy and I have all the time, I can finally sleep, right? Or, I mean, I was thinking of that a little more dominantly as you were talking, but then when you explain back in, the 1940s, like, okay, not everybody was super wealthy, right? It's like that just was kind of the norm. So maybe that discounts things a little bit. Or like you said, a doctor or a nurse that's kind of, working throughout the night. Like in many cases, they may also be experiencing sleep deprivation here and there,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe that does discount the wealth notion a little bit, but there is this feeling of like even when I was a student, and I know, some of my family that members that are students, like your day is so packed with stuff that it's really like in order to get it all done, you are either actively going, all right, I'm not going to sleep as much, or you have to kind of table it and be okay with less, which I think is the hard part to come to terms with. I don't know.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that? The association of wealth and adequate sleep?
I think people definitely still view sleep as a luxury rather than a necessity. I think that, it kind of fits. I guess I would equate wealth or like hustle culture to that of it's just like, or it's I think it's really worn as a badge of honor. I think people pride themselves on like, I can get by on very little sleep, or like a lot of these, CEOs of startup companies or people that work for startups, it's kind of just glamorized that, the pain or the harder you work means that you're more valuable or you're doing better things, or, you're working harder or something like that. When actually what we know about sleep is that you're going to be so much more effective and your brain's going to function so much better and everything is going to um, be better, but it's just not viewed that way. So I do think there's just some kind of cultural and perceptual views on that. And I do think that, um, yeah, I just think people haven't realized the lasting impacts and the long-term impacts that that has. I mean, we know immediately you can feel after one poor night of sleep if you just, whether it's because you stayed up late because you needed to finish a project or you were studying or whatever it is, that next day is rough. And so it's like it's called sleep debt. And what we know is that, we always kind of think like, oh, well, then I'll just oversleep more on the weekends or I'll make up for it the next day. I'll sleep a lot more. I'll sleep in. But it doesn't work that way. There's a process there's a system called your glymphatic system. And it's similar to the lymphatic system in that it takes out the trash. The glymphatic system only works while you're asleep. And so when you miss out on that process of removing the waste and the toxins that build up during the day, when you miss out on that sleep, it just doesn't happen. And so that waste just continues to build up. So that next night, when you do go to sleep, there's still the buildup from the day before. And so that's kind of why it's called sleep debt, because it's sort of just, and no need to panic if you've had some, if you've pulled a few all-nighters here and there, know that it's okay, but just understand what's happening when you choose to do that, if that's within your control to avoid that.
How long does it take theoretically to get out of sleep debt, or is it just not possible? Like you're kind of chronically in it?
So I don't know. There's not like an actual prescription of like, okay, well, if you had one bad night's sleep, then you need, 3 months of sleep to even it
Right.
out. We don't have, there may be that. If there is, I'm not aware of it. But I think it's just more to know that like it's not as simple as if I miss out here, I can make up for it there.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. It needs, like, you almost need to be back in a rhythm. Because I almost think, like, I read this somewhere, again, a few years ago. I think it was the guy he was like the president of the American Sleep Association or something like that, right? And I remember it being interesting to hear that, like, waking up at the same time every day to him was more important than the hours of sleep even that you got sometimes. So it was almost like, hey, if you happen to be up till 3, but you normally get up at 7, instead of, sleeping till whatever to make up your full 8 hours, you'd rather get up at 7 to maintain your circadian rhythm and I guess make it up with naps or something. I don't know. How important is that in your experience?
Yeah, I do think that maintaining the consistent sleep and wake time is really important, especially because in that example, and I think this is what happens to a lot of people is right, then they will go ahead and oversleep that next day. And then now your sleep pressure is lower. So then you're not going to be tired when you should go to bed. And then it kind of just
Right.
perpetuates the cycle of going to bed later, sleeping in later, and kind of being off. And our cells kind of have within them these 24-hour rhythms that tell your body when to digest food, when to repair certain systems, when certain things need to happen. And so when you get thrown off from that rhythm, it's really hard to recalibrate, which is why, we experience things like jet lag, or we could call it social jet lag for weekends or holidays, things like that. So yeah, I definitely think that the consistency is probably more helpful than trying to, know that like, okay, that day's going to be rough, but then that night go to bed at kind of your usual time. And hopefully that can help get you back on track a little bit faster.
I've been really excited to ask you about the cycles of sleep or the stages of sleep, right? Because this is something that I feel like on every wearable, right? Like Aura rings, Whoop straps to Apple Watches, even mattresses now that have like the built-in tracker or whatever. It spits out that data, right? That like, hey, there's the light sleep you got, and here's the deep sleep, here's the REM sleep. Does like it, but there never seems to be kind of a way to actually like, hey, do this to try to improve your REM sleep. If
Mm.
like you should, because I don't know what the number is, but is it like 35% of your sleep should be deep and REM sleep, or something like that. I don't know. You can speak more to that, but I'm curious with those two specific cycles. They seem important. Can you influence the deepness of
Yes.
your cycles there?
Yeah, absolutely. So for deep sleep, that is our most restorative and really rejuvenating stage of sleep. That is when things like your immune system gets refreshed, toxins are flushed from the brain, muscles repair and grow. And so you actually tend to get more deep sleep in the first half of the night. So, like for me, I notice if I get to bed later than normal for some reason, it ends up cutting into my deep sleep. Um,
Hmm.
the flip side, REM sleep, you actually get more of that the second half of the night. And so if I had a really early wake up call or, wanted to get up early for a workout class or something, like I was cutting into my REM sleep. So it actually helped me I have an Aura ring, I'm a big fan. To rearrange my schedule a little bit to work out at a time that wasn't going to interfere with my REM sleep. And I can definitely feel the difference when I get not enough deep or REM. I can tell in just like how I feel. Um, it's been an interesting thing to track. But as far as deep sleep, the things that are going to help to promote getting more or better quality deep sleep are things like keeping your schedule consistent, like we just touched on, um, avoiding heavy meals really late in the day. So we talk a lot about kind of having like a larger breakfast. I think it's eat like a king at breakfast, a prince at lunch, and then a pauper at dinner. So
I
kind of
like
like
that.
having less. I don't know if you have followed any of the stuff that Brian Johnson's doing, but he eats his last meal at like 11 in the morning because he
Wow,
found that when he ate any later in the day, it would affect his sleep. And he's gotten like a perfect sleep score for like over 6 months on the Whoop now, which is like
that's crazy.
hasn't been done before, which is amazing. And so it's obviously there's so much bio individuality. So it's again, he's been tracking himself and noticing these metrics. So it's like not everyone is going to need to eat their last meal at 11 o'clock, but experimenting with that and figuring out. So I know for myself, kind of when my cutoff time in the evening is where I don't want to be eating anymore, because it definitely affects your quality of sleep, or it's like your heart rate won't lower as much and you can't, yeah, get as refreshed. So yeah, avoiding heavy meals. Another thing to avoid would be stimulants. So, having caffeine, or things even like alcohol, that's going to disrupt sleep in the evening. And then also bright screens and all of those things kind of 1 to 2 hours before bed. So it really just speaks to the importance of having a really good wind down routine and creating one that you look forward to, that you enjoy, because I think sometimes we can feel, well, first of all, people need to get on board of loving sleep and loving all the benefits of sleep first. Until they're there, then it's going to be kind of a battle because people are really tied to a lot of these things that they enjoy doing. But if you can create a routine that you equally look forward to and enjoy, of whether that's, listening to music, journaling, reading, taking a hot bath, meditating, they're making a cup of tea and unwinding with a friend, chatting with a friend or a loved one or spouse. Those are all wonderful kind of rituals to create in the evening to help prepare your system. Everything is about, kind of nervous system regulation. So a lot of time all day long, we tend to lean heavy into our sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight, which is kind of the stress, preparing the body for action, responding, doing. But we need to be able to switch into the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest system. So that's going to help you be calm. And then that's also what needs to become more active when you go to sleep. So, yeah, so wind down routine is huge. Also, um, exercising regularly can increase deep sleep as well. So having daily movement is really important for so many reasons, but specifically for deep sleep, that can help. And then I'll pause there if you have any reactions
No, I was just
along from.
that it seems like there's a lot more variables that can actually affect this than, was previously kind of known or because you normally in like the Whoop app, for example, right? They just give you the number of like, hey, you should have hit 35%, right? And you're like, oh, I'm nowhere near that. But what do you do, right? And it seems like it ranges from everything of what you're eating, the light that you're getting in. Like that's been something I've been a little more conscious of because I wear glasses, and so I have like a blue light version or whatever that I kind of switch into or try to as I'm getting closer to, bedtime or whatever. So I guess it's really just testing some of these things. Were you going to say, or did you say, breathing, like bringing, because you mentioned bringing your system down a little bit?
Hmm. Yeah, breathing is great. I just mentioned it as part of a wind down routine. So, it's like you can't say like, okay, don't eat a heavy meal, don't be in front of screens, like all the no's. It's like, okay, well, what can you do instead? And
Yeah.
so one of those things to do would be, some breath work, meditation, mindfulness. There's a million apps now, YouTube things that you can watch that are great. Um, yeah, and then so when it comes to REM sleep, we know that REM is when we're dreaming. That's when a lot of memory consolidation happens, creativity. And so, like I mentioned, that's more in the latter half of the night. And so the things that can really help with REM sleep are getting that full night's sleep, right? So being able to kind of get your 8 hours in. Again, sticking to a regular sleep schedule is going to help with REM sleep as well. And then avoiding stimulants like caffeine or alcohol in the evening can really help increase your chances of getting more REM.
One of the things I'm curious about is when you write before bed, like when you, let's say you brain dump, right? And you're like, here's everything I got to do tomorrow. Like, here's what I'm worried about. Here's for the next few days, here's what I got to do. How much does that affect like focus for the next day? Because if you kind of almost like set something into motion before you go to sleep,
Mm.
is there a way to use your sleep to influence that kind of focus? You know what I mean? Where it's like, I want to work on this specific project tomorrow, right?
Mhm.
It's almost like doing a first draft before bed so that you have your brain works through the second draft while you're sleeping. Is that even possible?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that's really cool about rest in general, whether that's taking a break, taking a nap, or sleep, is that the brain goes through so many processes of whether it's memory consolidation or even, for example, if you're just kind of allowing yourself to daydream or mind wander, your default mode network is what comes online. And this is a network that brings together information in new ways and helps you solve problems or come up with new creative insights. And so that's why a lot of the time people will, it's kind of like when I'm in the shower or just like walking the dog, or I'll wake up in the middle of the night and have an idea, or like first thing in the morning. And it's because you're sort of getting out of your own way and allowing your brain to do its thing. Um, I will say, I think doing a brain dump kind of before bed is a great idea um, from a regulate your nervous system perspective so that you're not kind of stressed, like ruminating on it, because you want to sort of just like get it out and then be able to actually sleep and rest. I think that where it could backfire is if you're like, oh, I really need to solve this problem. And then it kind of like keeps your mind, ramps it up so that it's busier and then
Yeah.
it's harder to fall asleep. So there's kind of a fine line there of like using it as more of like a dump and then just letting it being like, this is what's going to happen. But there's also this really beautiful space that is like as you're preparing for sleep and then as you first wake up, where your brain is transitioning into these slower brainwave activity when you're asleep. So you're transitioning into it and then transitioning out of it. And when you're in those kind of transition theta alpha waves, your brain is more susceptible to ideas. So that's why, like, first thing in the morning, setting intentions or affirmations or gratitude can be really great, because you're sort of your your brain is in a way more open or more susceptible to those ideas. So it's a really great time to kind of plant those seeds for what things that you want to create and to kind of let your brain work on it. So I love the idea of kind of, giving some prompts without creating stress or anxiety before bed to let yourself kind of just marinate on. I think that's a really cool way to leverage sleep and rest.
I love that. I wanted to kind of circle back to something you mentioned up top when we started, which was how everything in our modern world kind of creates friction towards sleep, right? One of the things is also the social, element of it, whether it's like, you going out and doing stuff, or it's even you scrolling on your phone. I wanted to ask you about the impact of parasocial relationships, right? I feel like that has become even more of a big thing in the last decade or two, whether we kind of acknowledge it or not. It's kind of like you've got your go-to top five that podcasts, YouTube videos, however you engage with them, and it feels similar a lot of times, right? Of like, or even better in many cases than maybe talking to that person directly. Like I say this with Jeff
Mm.
Bezos or somebody, right? It's like if we had a conversation, face to face, I'm not sure it would be very productive or if he would reveal even the types of things that I'd want to hear, right? But when you hear him maybe on a podcast and he's talking to somebody who's like on his level and he can talk shop with, all of a sudden you're getting access to these crazy things that were previously only available through like an apprenticeship or mentorship that you had before in person like that. And so what you also said about the 1940s and how people were sleeping more like back then made me think of this. It's like there's definitely more opportunity to make connections and have relationships with people. But you know how there's that number, I don't know what it was, 150 or 300, that's
Mm.
like in your tribe that it's hard, they said that like that's the amount of people that you can kind of have relationships with or connect with. And then it starts to get really, like a lot. And now those numbers feel like they're nothing, right? It's like you're dealing in millions or thousands or tens of thousands.
Mm.
So how does that affect, right? The role of, I guess, parasocial relationships in our life now, I guess.
I think it's fascinating, and I did a quick search and I actually wasn't able to find very much. So I think this is such a new area in terms of how people are getting social interaction or feeling social connectedness or being able to learn or feel like, someone's mentoring me through their books, through their podcasts, through things without ever meeting them. I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. So I'm sure someone has looked into it somewhere. Wasn't able to really dig into it. I mean, I know just and even there's just emerging work even on like a Zoom call virtual interaction versus in person, and we know the differences there of just having um, you know virtual interactions can still increase our feelings of social connectedness and increase positive affect, but of course face to face has greater benefits for psychological well-being and feeling positive. So it's kind of interesting how there's this layer of like the virtualness of it, but then also that you don't even have to necessarily be in a direct conversation with a person, but you can still feel like they're keeping you company almost. Or like, I know there's certain podcasts that I listen to regularly, and it's like I feel like they're my friend, or they're, as I'm cooking dinner or doing chores or something, it's like they're just in your ear. And it's like this really interesting way of connecting or feeling connected. So I'm not exactly sure. My guess is just that there is some benefit to feeling so, having that connection to another human or being able to relate to someone or to learn from them. But we don't know at this point how that's changing our brain health, or kind of the neural response to it. And what's interesting is like our brains have not, if we look at the grand scheme of all of history and I think about how long technology has been in the picture for that, I think it's like,
It's
if
crazy.
they, yeah, it's like I actually don't know the exact number, but it was I heard one analogy at one point, and this is not, don't quote me on this, but it was something like if all of human history was like a year long, then we would have had technology for like maybe a second, like to just kind of
Wow.
put in perspective just how short it is that we have been around this and been interacting with it. So, and the learning curve for how exponentially things have increased just in our lifetime or just in the last 10, 20 years, right? We've had to adapt to a lot. And so our brain systems haven't changed all that much, though. Our brain systems are still the same in terms of there's the reward system, there's our systems to, focus and execute and be motivated and accomplish goals. And there's systems for social connection and feeling that tribal belonging and, safety and all that. So it's kind of like all of these new things, these new ways of interacting and connecting with people are still filtered through an old grid that was at once, majority in person. So I think that it's not necessarily changing us, but it is just interesting to see how we're using those things to get at some fundamental needs that the brain is wired and designed for.
Right. Like, for example, let's say, like there's a bunch of Facebook groups, right? So people in your immediate, friends and family network, like even in your town, maybe, right? Okay, you might not be able to connect with exactly those types of people at scale, but all of a sudden you're in this group and it's like, oh, everybody, there's a commonality to all of us. We're all into this one thing or whatever. And you feel kind of a sense of like, oh, I'm at home here, right?
Hmm.
I almost have a guess where I feel like because it's going so much in one direction, right, where everything's tech heavy, um, you're starting to see, especially after COVID, right, a lot more like conferences and meetups and like 1 day, 3 day events where people who have that kind of reach and can bring together those types of folks are doing so. I mean, there's so many examples: live podcasts, live just get like last second get-togethers, right? Like, hey, I'm in New York City, like we rented out the theater and there's room for 400 people, and like all of a sudden you're like, whoa, these are the 400 people. Like, it's kind of like going to a concert, right? You're like, oh, we all like this one artist, like
Hmm.
that's the one thing we all kind of have in common here. And then I think the other end of it is it's like kind of like books where sometimes when you're going through a lot of resistance, you might read Stephen Pressfield's War of Art, right? Sometimes if you want, you feel like you're trying to develop better habits, you're like, all right, where's James Clear? Let me pull that off the shelf. So it's almost like that has always existed. There just wasn't as much of a selection as there is now, where it's like it's so dynamic. You could watch somebody, you could listen to somebody, you could read their stuff. So I'm curious too, just like you, like where this all leads in
Hmm.
another decade or two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's neat to have just access to more facets of people and to feel like, and of course there's like the components that we have access to are very curated for the most part, or it's like we can think we know someone or feel like we know someone, but really we only know these glimpses or whatever they choose to share. So that's another interesting element of it as well.
Yeah, how do you think that part affects your brain a little bit? Because it's almost like some people have done this for ages, right? You kind of had a double life almost, right? You're one way here and then one way there. But now it's almost very rare to find somebody who's just themselves all the way through across every platform, every live interaction. It's like you almost don't see that anymore. It's like there is a distinction between, okay, this is the online avatar of you, and then here's the what you're like in person sometimes.
Hmm.
What do you think that, impact is that going to impact the way our brain kind of, I don't know, is affected or deals with things like having to maintain two lives in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that well, so I was thinking of it more from the like the spectator side or the in the
Oh yeah.
audience side of like feeling like you know someone or not, and almost like really having to remember that social media is not real, or that like everything I'm seeing has been curated and filtered, and whether or not it's using an actual edit, color filter, but like truly that these are chosen moments that this person is choosing to share. I think as I guess and then also from kind of the audience side, the other thing I was thinking about as you're talking is just this idea that like we as a generate well, I'll say I know Gen Z. I'm not Gen Z, but I think millennials
Yeah,
as
I don't
well.
know you.
Um, like really hate inauthenticity and can spot it from a mile away. So a lot of people aren't going to get that far if they aren't being authentic. So I do think that there is like a pull to go back towards being a little more real and more raw. Um, but at the end of the day, I mean, I don't know, it's such a toss up because it's like and this wasn't something that people had to deal with before, but it's just like, do you really want all of those hard moments, like, on video captured for everyone to see? Or, like
Right.
we go in so many different stages of growth as a human. And I think back to just like, no, like as a teenager, what I thought was important or what was really worrisome to me or the things that, I was concerned with are just so far from like who I am today or just ways that I've changed and evolved. So it's just, I think, anyway, I think that there's something really important about that. And then as far as like what it's doing to our health in terms of trying to maintain like an online persona or a brand, and then also be ourselves in everyday life. I mean, I think the closer that those things are to being the same, definitely the
Right.
better. I think it is really straining on mental health or a certain pressure to look or be a certain thing that is, like I said, just not real or not possible, just not realistic. So I do think that's really hard. And then we also know that, people will say and do things on the internet that they would never do or say in person, whether
Yeah,
that's
right.
being like kind of on the the cyberbullying side of things, or just even in a like here I feel like I'm really just having a conversation with you, so I'm able to relate and talk to you and share in that way versus like if I was sitting in front of a room of strangers, maybe I would not be as open or, just kind of like the psychological phenomenon of that is
Right.
really interesting. So there's so many different facets to this new dimension of ourselves, or kind of this extension of our personality and who we are that we get to create. And it's really interesting to see almost like an art of just how people choose to portray themselves and to show up in these virtual spaces.
Yeah, I think so too. What do you think in the next like decade, right? I know a decade seems like it's going to be a long time. Like now things move so quick that like maybe 5 years will be the equivalent of like 10 years of, living. Like, what is going to be the biggest struggle for our brains that we can kind of prepare for? I know we talked about focus a little bit. We talked
Mhm.
about decision making. I've even heard like loneliness, right? The loneliness
Yeah.
epidemic where like yeah, there's that. There's the distraction element, right? Where it's like it's just hard to focus because your brain's like, constantly going. Um, how like to the point where you need like your the dumb phones and all those things are making their way back, right? So that says something, I think, about like what is the bigger challenge that we're facing with our hardware at the moment,
Mhm.
and what will that continue to be? Do you have any guesses?
So I agree with you in terms of things like being distracted and info overload and loneliness. I think those are all huge. I did a lot of work around the neuroscience of kindness, empathy, and compassion. And so loneliness is just, it is declared an epidemic. And social connection is so vital to us surviving as a species and flourishing. So I think that's a huge one. Another one that I think that I see a lot, especially in younger generations, is a lack of purpose, or things just being almost too easy or too comfortable, or having too much access to things. It's like there's, or just that, it used to be when you asked little kids what they want to be when they grow up, they would say like a teacher, a doctor, or whatever. And now it's like they just say they want to be famous. And like
Right.
seeing or they want to be an influencer, they want to have a following. And it's like, there needs to be like having a sense of purpose is one of the most important things that we see to help protect against things like cognitive decline or aging. Having a real connection to, like why I should wake up every day and what I'm doing. And it's interesting because you see this with celebrities all the time, with people that get a lot of status or fame, and it becomes very hard for them to be happy and fulfilled and content because they no longer, it's like kind of, anyway, they're just off target from being able to connect with that purpose again. I guess there's just like too much. And so anyway, I think that that's a really big one for younger generations, to be able to not get sucked into kind of just what looks really glamorous and wonderful, and to really be pursuing those things, and to not be too lonely or too distracted, to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think when you say purpose, it almost sounds to me like something that can be designed now. It's like not something you're just given. I mean, in many cases, that's also what's happening, right? It's like here's the narrative of what the purpose is, and so this is the easy thing to grab onto. But never in history have we had kind of like the act, like just short of putting the chip in your brain and letting it do everything, right? It's almost like we can kind of do that. Like you can download information into your brain by what you're consuming. You can choose to put yourself around different people without leaving your geography. Like all these things are, I think going to be interesting to see how like if everybody had unlimited resources almost to choose how they wanted to like design their brain and how they live, it's almost like we're going to get to see a social experiment of that. It's like, does everybody go the easy way, or are there still, does it make everybody seek out harder things and, stuff that isn't so flashy and things like that, almost causes a reversal of that desire.
Yeah. I also think with purpose, to your point, it's not like, oh, this is my one purpose that I'm like, you're just given. Like, have to definitely think that you find it, or you experiment, or you can create it in a sense, like, of getting it. And I think it's something people struggle to find. I guess the thought behind that one was just, instead of kind of glamorizing the end result, really instilling this sense of like, I do this, like, it's the whole cliche of enjoying the journey rather than the destination. And I think because we have access to see and hear from all these successful people, we just see that end point rather than seeing like kind of the underlying factors that are driving them, or where they really get their fulfillment and purpose from, that was able to help them kind of achieve or do the things that they're doing. So um, yeah, I just think that's something that I want, that you don't really get taught in school, and it's not something you really get, coaching on, unless you have great parents, friends, mentors in your life that are helping to shape that, or guide you, or give you experience or exposure to those different things. So I just think it's a really essential part, um, that is kind of, yeah, it just isn't really central.
Yeah. Okay. I'm curious now, like for you, as we've, had this conversation, we've talked about focus, information overload. What for you would be like the download that somebody could take if they could just like, it was a USB drive and they just stick it in their head after this conversation? What would you want them to take into the rest of the year, right? The next 6 months, a year, test this out, play with it, hear a few concepts that are worth, upgrading the health of your brain.
So this was hard to choose. I think I have a couple, but I would say, you know, mental flexibility and curiosity and compassion. Um, and they kind of all overlap, but I think that the one thing that our brain is incredibly good at and is designed for is being flexible, adaptable, being agile, and that's very different than anything machines can currently do. So that is something that makes us human, as well as the compassion piece of like connecting us to other humans and connecting our work and what we're doing and why, to just that fundamental essence of being human. So I think that that's something that, again, is not easily practiced, of like, oh, let me do my exercises of mental flexibility, right? But it's something you can practice in reframing situations and mistakes, in learning to see things from different perspectives, in trying to generate as many different possibilities and ideas as you can, and not just kind of thinking this is the one right way. That's a really great way that I think everyone can push themselves in and grow in. And I think it's going to be absolutely essential for us in the next 5 years, 10 years, I think, and beyond.
This is related to one thing I wanted to ask you that I kind of forgot, but I'm glad you brought this up. But mental flexibility, how closely could you relate that to like the concept of mental frameworks or mental models, where at least when I think of that word, what comes to mind is like, okay, I know all of this information, right? But when I hear somebody package it up with a term or coin it in a certain way, oh, it makes sense now. Like, oh, like I now will never forget it. Like there's something about something being packaged up into like, oh, here are the three things of this, right? Or um I think the example I gave was like Ramit Sethi, he's a famous dude. He's got a Netflix show and whatnot. I Will Teach You to Be Rich. He's a finance guy. And he has this term called phantom costs, right? Which are really, it just means hidden fees. Like, what are the hidden costs of what you're kind of doing and spending your time on and money on? And for some reason, like giving it that language of phantom costs, right? It sounds more appealing than hidden fees. It also just like is a little stickier for your brain. That's what I'm thinking of when the concept of mental models or frameworks kind of comes to mind. Is that something that is helpful, or that is worth practicing? Is like, okay, if if we are all like have access to the same information, right, the next step is like curating some of that into understandable bits, because it's amazing when your brain is presented with all of it, it can't make sense of it many times. Like you'll miss something, right? But there's something about it being phrased in that way that can be like, oh yeah, this is phantom costs. I know exactly, how
Yeah.
that's working in my life.
I'll have to introduce you to one of my colleagues, Dr. Dan Krasik. He does a lot with reasoning. He's a cognitive neuroscientist as
Oh,
well.
cool.
And he does a lot with mental models and thinking in analogies and the importance of that. But so he could probably have a more in-depth conversation on that specific
I
topic
would
and do
love
a
that.
deep dive with you. But um, it's extremely helpful to think in analogies, to make things concrete, to make them relatable. Mental models are sort of these frameworks that we have to navigate the world. So it's like whether we realize it or not, we have a mental model for education or a mental model for relationships or a mental model for a chair, right? Like all these different things of like, these are the components it has and this is how it works. And um, I think they're largely kind of just they're already there and established, and you don't necessarily even realize, oh, this is my mental model for that. And so when something violates it, it doesn't fit. And I was thinking about this, and this is like, I think this was a myth, so I don't know that this is true, but it was like when, Christopher Columbus came to North America and the Native Americans, like they said that they didn't see the ships coming because they didn't have a mental model for those type of ships. Like they didn't even, so like they didn't see them until they were like on shore. And I
Right.
again, that's a myth. I don't know if that's like that they perceptually couldn't actually perceive them because they didn't know, like it was just so beyond something that they had a category for. But I think that's a good almost just analogy or way to think about models of things that are like it's hard for us to conceive of things that we just can't get our arms around in a sense. So like um it's a
Almost like
really
AI too, right? It's like we're
yeah,
developing a mental model now for AI because it's like, oh, we didn't think it would be so in our face and like, something we have to react to. But now we're
yeah,
starting to like ease into some way to
exactly.
use it.
And that's how every new technology, every new thing, we create a new model for that. But yeah, I think it's actually a great brain healthy exercise. It engages your frontal lobe, your frontal networks to think more deeply about those things, to recognize them. And also thinking in analogies not only helps greatly with understanding and explaining things with teaching, but they say like if you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it. I know Steve Jobs was huge on analogies and did a lot of that in their marketing and how products work because they were creating new categories for things, right? No one had a mental
Right.
model for an iPod or an iPhone, right? It was like these
Yeah.
new things. So we had to be able to help people understand what they are, which is challenging, but can definitely, it's people do it all the time. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to be aware of because I know for myself, it's like I don't think about the models that I have. They're just there. They've been constructed from just living.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess that's the difference with a framework versus the model, right? Is the framework could be more engineered based on like some like a quick understanding of something versus the model is more maybe a subconscious thing that exists for a while.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, Dr. Julie, I really appreciate you taking the time and hanging out today and dropping a ton of, noteworthy moments. Where can we continue to follow your work? Where can we kind of support what you're doing? Let us know. I would love to know.
Yeah, I am most active on Instagram. My handle is just at Dr. Julie Fratantoni. And I have a monthly/weekly newsletter called Better Brain that is on Substack, and I can share the link for that.
I'm signed up for that as well, and it's amazing. I will include the links to all this stuff in the description as well. But thanks again for hanging out. Appreciate you taking the time, and we'll catch up soon.
This was fun. Thank you.